Imagine working 16 hours in a dark, suffocating coal mine, crawling out covered in soot and sweat, only for your boss to hand you a brass token stamped with the company's name instead of real cash. For over a century and a half after the United States declared its independence, this scenario was entirely legal. There was no minimum wage, no maximum work hours, no child labor bans, and no safety regulations. The wealthiest nation on earth was built on an industrial system that treated human labor as a disposable commodity. Before the landmark passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, the way American workers were paid depended entirely on what employers felt like giving them, and the reality was often brutal. In the early decades of the Republic, the concept of a Friday paycheck or an hourly wage didn't exist for the vast majority of Americans. Roughly 80% of the population lived on subsistence farms, growing just enough to feed their families. Cash was incredibly scarce in rural communities, which relied heavily on complex barter economies. Neighbors traded eggs for flour, livestock for tools, and labor for lodging. Even in the skilled urban trades, labor was deeply personal. Apprentices lived with a master craftsman for up to 7 years, exchanging their hard work for housing, food, and training. Once they became journeymen, their wages were negotiated face-to-face, resulting in inconsistent, unregulated, but functional local agreements. Everything shattered with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. As massive textile mills, ironworks, and meatpacking plants sprouted across the country, corporations required vast armies of unskilled laborers to perform repetitive, grueling tasks for 12 to 16 hours a day. Millions of immigrants fleeing war, persecution, and poverty flooded into American cities, providing the raw fuel for this new industrial engine. During the late 19th century Gilded Age, the average factory worker earned a staggering 20 cents an hour, bringing home roughly $6 to $10 a week. While that might sound manageable on paper, it had to cover soaring city rents, food, medicine, and clothing for an entire family. Because a single income was mathematically impossible to survive on, working-class households had to put every pair of hands to work. By 1900, roughly 20% of American children under the age of 15 held full-time jobs. In southern textile mills, children as young as 5 were hired because their tiny fingers could reach inside active machinery to clear jams. In the Appalachian coal regions, young breaker boys spent 10 hours a day hunched over fast-moving conveyor belts, sorting sharp slate from raw coal with their bare hands. They earned a mere 40 to 70 cents a day, enduring mangled fingers and blackened lungs just to help their families afford rent. In remote mining towns and lumber camps, employers took exploitation one step further by eliminating cash altogether. Companies built entire isolated towns from scratch, owning the mines, the houses, the schools, and the grocery stores. They paid their workers in company script, privately minted metal tokens or paper slips that could only be redeemed at the company-owned store. Because workers had no real U.S. currency and no transportation to reach outside markets, they were trapped. The company stores routinely jacked up prices by 10 to 60% compared to independent merchants. When a miner's script inevitably failed to cover the cost of basic food and boots, the company extended high-interest credit, ensuring the worker was trapped in a perpetual cycle of debt. They were working not to build a future, but simply to pay off what they already owed to the boss. In northern cities, the garment industry pioneered the notorious sweatshop system. Tens of thousands of young immigrant women and girls were packed into cramped, unventilated workshops, earning just $3 to $6 a week for grueling 13-hour shifts. To prevent workers from taking breaks or stealing fabric, factory managers routinely locked the exit doors from the outside. The horrifying consequence of this practice was laid bare during the historic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. When flames engulfed the upper floors of the Manhattan workshop, trapped women found the stairwells locked. 146 workers perished in less than 40 minutes, many jumping to their deaths onto the crowded sidewalks below. This catastrophic lack of regulation resulted in an average of 675 workplace deaths every single week in the 1880s. Surviving an injury meant nothing. If a worker lost an arm to a machine, they received no compensation and were simply replaced the next morning. It was from this cauldron of systemic suffering that the American labor movement was forged in blood and sacrifice. Early unions like the Knights of Labor rallied hundreds of thousands of workers to strike for a radical new concept, the 8-hour workday. However, corporate owners and politicians retaliated aggressively. Following the Haymarket affair in Chicago, where a peaceful rally turned fatal after a bomb explosion, labor organizers were heavily branded as dangerous radicals, causing union membership to temporarily collapse. The struggle intensified during the severe economic depression of 1893, when railroad magnate George Pullman slashed worker wages by 25% but refused to lower the high rents in his company town. A massive national rail strike ground American transportation to a halt. The federal government intervened brutally, deploying 12,000 troops to crush the strike, resulting in dozens of worker deaths. Over the decades, every major push for basic human dignity, like the grueling 9-week Lawrence textile strike of 1912, was met with severe pushback from both corporate militias and the legal system. For years, the Supreme Court repeatedly struck down state-level minimum wage and maximum hour laws, claiming they violated a worker's constitutional freedom of contract, ignoring the reality that a starving laborer had zero bargaining leverage against a massive corporation. The ultimate breaking point arrived with the Great Depression. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was completely unemployed, and those who kept their jobs watched desperation drive wages down to 12 cents an hour. Recognizing that the unregulated free market had collapsed into catastrophe, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt fought to establish a permanent legislative floor for American workers. Alongside his relentless Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, who had personally witnessed the horrors of the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, Roosevelt championed the historic Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. The political battle was fierce, requiring massive structural compromises, including the controversial exclusion of agricultural and domestic laborers to secure necessary Southern votes. Yet when the act was finally signed into law, it changed American society forever. It established the nation's first federal minimum wage at 25 cents an hour, capped the standard work week, banned oppressive child labor, and made it strictly illegal to pay workers in company script. It asserted that a civilized society must place human dignity above total corporate freedom. The protections modern workers enjoy today were not gifts from the market. They were hard-won victories paid for by generations who fought, bled, and died for the right to a decent living.